Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Digital Law News. So I'm Laura Spencer, and I'm joined with my colleague Peter Wright. So this is a weekly webinar and flash podcast that we do, basically bringing you a slight taste of what we discuss in our weekly meetings. So just in case you don't know, Digital Law is a specialist law firm located in Barnsley in the UK, and we deal with things such as digital law matters, things to do with technology, international data transfers, all things data protection and things like that. So I'll just pass over to Peter to introduce himself a little bit.
Indeed, thank you very much, Laura. So hello everyone, and as Laura says, we focus on everything from digital and tech matters to supporting businesses with regards to things like international data transfers, compliance, e-commerce in different countries, app development, etc. And as part of that, I will just flag up now the fact we did a brilliant webinar yesterday, and we were joined by a couple of colleagues from both the Law Society of England and Wales, Brussels office, and also a Brussels legal tech journalist, so we could look at the recent Schrems 2 data privacy case. So if you're interested in the EU-US Privacy Shield and will be interested in hearing some more on that in detail, there is an hour-long webinar, and that will be appearing in our podcast feed as well. So you can listen to it as a podcast, and it will also be going up live on our website. So please do feel free to take a look there.
Right. So we'll get started on the stories because we've got quite a few to get through today. So the first one we're going to be talking about is Strava. So some of you may know that Strava is a fitness app, so you can record like your runs on it, your bike rides and things like that. So some of the users are now calling out some of the app's privacy settings. So one user in particular put a tweet on, I think it was last week, and said that she ran past the same girl a couple of times on her morning run, and Strava has automatically added her as a group activity, and there's no way to remove this. So what seems to be happening is when you upload your details to Strava and then go out on your daily run or anything, that does record it, and obviously that highlights a few issues in terms of being away from home. And obviously if your other people's personal data is getting onto your phone that you don't actually know, whereas the question is like where your personal data is going as well.
Indeed. So the thing here is remembering on all apps like this, take a look at the privacy settings, because by default, these apps are collecting a huge amount of your personal information in terms of the GPS tracking information from where your device is running, not just your location, but the speed that you're moving and the date and time of when those movements are taking place. So it can then plot maps and put all this information up online. And as can be seen, it's also then tracking onto other users and potentially putting you in groups with other people who might be undertaking similar runs or exercise in the area. The idea being to gamify the experience, the idea so you can be competitive with other people. And it would be great if that's all that data were being used for, but regrettably, it can be used for ulterior motives. And this is, don't forget, very personal data about potentially revealing where you live or indeed where you then go out exercising. And let's face it, many people are creatures of habit and might be going for a run every morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, and it's showing you not only where they're leaving from, it's whereabouts they'll be running. So it could be potentially revealing not just when your house is empty, it could be revealing where you're going to be running, and indeed where you might be running, where it could be rather quiet and secluded and could be putting you at risk. And that's the thing that very often gets overlooked. And I think we also need to flag up that when it comes to these apps as well, their security isn't necessarily great. There's these privacy issues that we're looking at here. There is also the fact that they are usually run via a smartwatch like this. This is a Fitbit, and you can connect that with your mobile device, but it does that via Bluetooth. And you very often find that the Bluetooth connection is not particularly secure, and it means that other devices could connect to that smartwatch and potentially access that personal data as well. So be very wary of the security and privacy settings on these devices.
Yeah, I think that summed it up perfectly, that one. So just moving on to the next one. This is still related to kind of the same area. As Peter's just mentioned, the Fitbit. So, but this is like on a different category, if you get me. So Google and Fitbit are now joining together. So I think Google is actually taking over Fitbit, and I think they're in the process of sealing the deal with that whole situation right now. However, the European Commission have said they will be carrying out a full-scale probe into Google's takeover of Fitbit, as they are concerned that the proposed transaction would further entrench Google's market position in the online marketing market by increasing the already vast amount of data that Google could use for personalisation of its services and displays. So I think there's another story after this as well regarding the whole market. But there was 4 big tech giants as well up again in was it the US, Peter?
It was indeed. They were appearing before the US Congress, before a committee. And they have taken, so basically the US is already looking at regulating those 4 big tech companies, which included Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple. And they're already concerned about the fact that they have massive market share. And now on the other side of the Atlantic Lake, we have the European Commission also taking a look and saying, we are concerned about the position that Google will potentially be in should this merger go through. Google is already collecting vast amounts of user data based on the people who use their Android operating system on phones, from the people who use Google, and in particular Google Chrome, in order to undertake searches. Not to mention the fact that then if you've got those devices, it's picking up your location, where you're going, what you're doing. It can get quite scary when you look at already on Google, you can actually get it to tell you your location and your habits, and it will give you that with a fair degree of accuracy. Therefore, it's not a massive leap to then think how even more invasive that could be if we then have Google having access to several hundred million Fitbit users, and all of that very rich personal data that we were just talking about in relation to Strava. Fitbit does the same thing. I have a Fitbit here. It tells me how many thousand steps I've done each day. It tells me things like how many calories I've burned. It tells me also, it tells me how often I'm exercising, how I'm sleeping, if I'm indeed sleep enough or too much. It tracks all of that. It gives you all of that data. You can then connect with other friends on there. So I must have about 30 or 40 different people I'm connected to on there. And all of that information is potentially then being passed to Google as a result of this. Now, of course, under GDPR, that data should only be used for the purpose for which it was intended, but it goes without saying if it's part of in Google's ecosystem, it doesn't take a massive leap to think of that data all being used by Google for its advanced search and tracking purposes. So hence the European Commission is taking a look at that. As is always the case, the European Commission takes a very long time to look at things. And then it'll be interesting to see if they actually do take any concrete action or not, and if in the meantime the US takes any action.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important to say as well, because people forget that some of the data that Fitbit and other smartwatches do collect is personal data, and it's very sensitive personal data as well.
Exactly. When you're talking about someone's habits, where they move, their daily habits, this is pretty important personal data. It's revealing where you live.
Yeah.
It's revealing when you're at that home and when you aren't. So there's not really much more sensitive than that, really, and it could be very easily abused.
Yeah, definitely. So this is now moving on to Microsoft and the whole TikTok. So we did mention, I think we've mentioned it for quite a few weeks now in these daily weekly updates, but you might have heard that Trump is trying to shut down TikTok in the US, but now he's saying that he's giving until the middle of next month for a US service to buy the American basically for an American company to buy out the American service of TikTok. And so Microsoft have said that they're going to do that. But then it is going to take quite a while to untangle as such from the Chinese software. So they're trying to make it into basically 2 separate apps. Is that right, Peter?
That's broadly the case, yes. They'd be wanting to make it clear that there is a US TikTok and that would then come under the ownership of Microsoft. There's several issues here. One is, as we've already said, about competition. Microsoft already own LinkedIn. They also own Skype. So they are a significant player when it comes to personal data, when it comes to monetizing that personal data, and of course through their increasing use of cloud subscription for the provision of their Office and Windows systems. They are an increasingly important player in the market. And it's interesting, I was just saying about those 4 companies that were before the US Congress last week. That was Apple, Facebook, Google, and Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, that was it. Microsoft was not one of them.
Yeah.
And that's quite scary, because it's almost like Microsoft is flying under the radar here. But certainly if they end up then owning the US TikTok, which, I mean, TikTok is the most highly downloaded app in the United States for the last 2 years. We're talking about a massive amount of data, a very popular app, but it will be difficult for TikTok to properly spin that out to an American subsidiary. One of the key questions to then ask is, how much will that US TikTok have of the global TikTok? Bearing in mind that the chief thing that sets TikTok apart from other social media apps is its algorithm.
Yeah.
That algorithm is the thing that then dictates when you scroll through it. And I was careful with this. I got a TikTok user to show me how this works, because I'll admit I'm not on there. And I think, Laura, you've even said that you're not a particular consumer of TikTok.
I go on it the odd time, but not to the extent that some other people do. Yeah.
Exactly. So I asked one of our colleagues in the office to show me how this operates. The way that literally you can then swipe downwards and see a succession of different videos of people doing different things. This algorithm then dictates what apps you then see, what videos you then see, and then the videos you see you can click and like and say you like or do not like or whatever. And the most popular one of the most popular users on TikTok has 75 million followers, or something in that region of 75 million. And indeed, this is a teenage girl who just records herself dancing in her bedroom and around the house. And it's now got to the point that her family members have also got millions of followers and are almost becoming a rival for the Kardashians in terms of popularity. Yet, they are totally created by TikTok, by this app. So then it's a matter of, will this algorithm, which is the thing that makes TikTok different from all the other platforms, are we talking about that being passed in its entirety to Microsoft or not? I suspect not will be the answer to that, which then will lead Microsoft to say, well, why should we invest tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in purchasing this thing if we aren't going to get access to that unique difference that makes TikTok so popular? So hence the thrust of this article in the Times is to say this could take an awful long time to go through. Not to mention the fact, of course, Laura, that we work with a lot of different tech clients in the area of social media, and when they end up putting their apps together, they are not designing them on a geographical, oh, here are all our American users, here are our British users, here are our European users. They just have users because they're building infrastructure to be as efficient as possible. So if you're then talking about having that broken down and trying to say, here are all the US users and here's all the US infrastructure, it's not designed and built to allow for that. So it's going to take a very long time potentially, and certainly far longer than President Trump appears to be envisaging here, for this sort of takeover to practically take place.
Yeah, definitely. I think this will be, like we always say every single week, TikTok and things that are going on in America with all this at the moment is going to be one that we will be continuing to cover over the next couple of weeks.
Indeed. At the rate we're going, we're doing a separate podcast just on the impact of US presidential politics on the tech scene. But there we go. So we are looking at an attack by ransomware hackers on Canon. Canon is one of the largest companies with regards to online tech systems with regards to camera and video footage, and they have been another victim of a cyber attack. What appears to have happened is that they received an email that then led to a phishing attack, and they were taken down by a piece of software called Maze. What then happened was their data, it looks like their data was locked, their personal data, their confidential commercial business data, and then it would have required a ransom to be paid. No one knows for sure if a ransom definitely has been paid, though the fact that the company recovered so very quickly from the attack suggests that this may have been the case, that a ransom was paid. Ordinarily, if there was an attack like this and then it takes several months potentially for the system to recover, that can be an indicator that in reality what has happened is that they have then had to recover the system from various backups, etc. And in this instance, it looked like that did not happen. So it looks like a ransom was paid, and it could have been in the region of several $1 million. This story in the Times actually then goes on to look at several other recent suspected ransomware attacks. And it also highlights the fact that you do not have to be an expert in order to undertake one of these attacks. Indeed, one of the major problems appears to be that software is available on the dark web that allows hackers to potentially undertake these attacks very quickly and easily. They do not have to be highly trained and skilled. They just merely need to download the tools and then could potentially undertake a ransomware attack and get potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in Bitcoin just by successfully compromising a significant business like Canon in this instance. So that's really flagging up the ongoing risk with regards to ransomware. Hopefully we can move on to the next slide. And we're looking at the ongoing issues with regards to scam victims who end up being treated unfairly. So what tends to happen, and we have actually worked with quite a few people who've been on the receiving end of scams like this. Indeed, last year we had one gentleman who has been trying to access his funds in relation to his pension, and £17,000 ended up being taken by what he thought was his financial advisor, but of course it in fact wasn't. And as a result, he lost a large part of his pension pot. The financial advisors wouldn't help, the bank wouldn't help, and he was just basically left severely out of pocket. And indeed, this point is being made that so many people are falling victim to these kinds of attacks, and nothing enough is being done practically to support them, particularly by the banks. It's the banks that are holding on to the money, the banks that are undertaking the transfers, and they're saying, well, we have our security measures in place. If they end up being compromised by hackers, if a hacker ends up infiltrating, then tough, really. And they aren't wanting to help as much as perhaps they could. Now, given that we are digitally quite a mature economy compared to other economies, we have large numbers of people who are digitally literate using their smartphones, tablets, apps in order to undertake things like their banking and financial services. And indeed, there's been a move, particularly within the financial services sector, to move people gradually towards undertaking more work online rather than going into banks and offices. Then really it stands to reason that when we are, in effect, people are being asked to undertake their business online, if that environment is not properly safe and secure, and indeed the environment being offered by the financial services institutions is not sufficiently safe and secure to undertake safely that volume of transactions, then we need to be thinking about how we support people who are victims of crime in that area, and indeed how the banks and other institutions can work to try and reduce the vulnerability of these systems to being compromised by scams, by those undertaking scams. Now I just wanted to take a quick look at this story with regards to facial recognition. And the key thing here is that this is a result of a court case that has taken place in Wales, whereby South Wales Police were using facial recognition software to scan people who they were then wanting to use that facial recognition software to profile, to sort of list their activity. Now, this is a potentially massive infringement of civil liberties, and that's why Liberty actually took South Wales Police to court. So the appeal judgment that's been handed down refers to a court case involving the Police and Crime Commissioner, the police superintendent for the area, as well as the Information Commissioner's Office. So they have all been involved, as has the Canberra Partnership involved in taking the images. And the individual, Mr. Bridges, who was involved in this, found that his information had been processed twice by this system. And the Court of Appeal has said, in effect, the invasive use of this technology breaches privacy and data protection laws, and also, quite chiefly, it also looks at the fact that no impact was looked on whether the use of this technology might unfairly disadvantage those in minorities. And that's quite important to do, because very often this technology is only as good as the data that is being fed into it. It was found to be a problem in the United States where systems were being used to process particularly outcomes in court cases, but of course the data that was being put into them was the result of existing criminal court cases, many of which unfairly disadvantaged those from ethnic minorities. So of course the predictive system started to track the same inherent biases as are inherent within the human system. So we have to be very careful with these systems to make sure that sometimes they don't replicate our own biases, and there appears to have been no attempt made to try and manage or reduce those biases in the way that this system is being used. So it's quite an important judgment that's been handed down here, and you'll notice that we've actually included the link there to the Guido Fawkes website, order.order.com, which appears to be the only media outlet that's bothered to actually cover this in any detail, and they have summarised in brief the main points behind this important judgment. And they've also then attached a link to the judgment itself, so you can actually read through it for yourself and read your own conclusions. But the lack of coverage in this in the mainstream media, when this is so important, when we think of the increase in personal data that is being processed this year, the increase in personal data being processed in order to so that the test and trace system can function, the increase in personal data being processed by bars and restaurants when we go into them, the increase in personal data being processed by the health service when it comes to all of these tests. It's therefore very important when we have this personal data being processed by the public sector, whether it's to keep us safe with the very best of intentions, we still need to make sure that it's complying with the basic principles around the rule of law. And therefore, when there is a judgment like this that says this data isn't being processed in accordance with our own data protection laws, we do need to sit up and take notice of that. So this is actually a very, very important judgment. And I think it's an issue that we'll be returning to quite a lot in our future news summaries. Now, this next story is with regards to Google and the vexed issue of smart speakers. Now, anyone who's got a smart speaker, an Amazon Alexa, perhaps at home, or if they've got Siri on their iPhone, they'll be used to being able to speak and ask those personal organisers different questions. But of course, you have to wake it up by saying, Alexa, can you blah, 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 blah. So, of course, Alexa has to be always listening in order to do that. And in this instance, it's been found that the Google Home smart speaker isn't just listening to your voice, it is listening to things that are taking place in your home. So in this instance, that's meant that an individual actually received a notification from Google to say that his smoke alarm was going off when he was cooking. So the alarm goes off at home. This is picked up by the smart speaker. The smart speaker then realizes that's happening and sends a notification saying, by the way, your smoke alarm is going off. Now, Google says that this was as a result of a particular feature on a software update that has now been reversed. So this shouldn't happen as a matter of routine. But there are many stories out there of the fact that these speakers are constantly listening. So even if in this instance they're saying, we will no longer then process that information and provide you with a notification depending on the information we've heard, it still stands to reason that the speaker has to be constantly listening 24 hours a day so it can hear you call its name if you want to speak to it. And then the issue of what happens with those recordings remains very live. Indeed, Amazon have got into trouble for this because they have admitted that they do store the recordings that their Alexa smart speaker takes. And then they have said that, yes, not only do they keep those recordings, they do undertake research using those recordings as well. So there are massive issues with regards to privacy when you're having these smart speakers at home. A big takeaway from this, even though it might be tempting to have one of these in the workplace, I would strongly recommend that you don't do that, because then you could find that business, personal data, confidential data and commercially sensitive data could end up being processed and stored on these smart speakers and potentially putting you in breach of data protection legislation as a result. I think that might be our last story. Oh no, we have one more. So it's not just the European Union that sometimes levies significant fines against tech giants. Twitter is expecting a fine of about $250 million because it's been misleading data about how it uses their data. Routinely, Twitter will ask for an email address and a phone number so it can enable multi-factor identification when you log onto the platform. And of course, users are providing that data for the purposes of accessing the platform. They are not providing that data so they can be marketed to, but that's exactly what ended up happening. And those email addresses and phone numbers were used for targeted advertising from 2013 to 2019. And the US Federal Trade Commission has said that that is misleading, and therefore Twitter is expecting that fine. This is a significant impact on a platform like Twitter, because we have to bear in mind that it doesn't have the vast number of users that Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok have. It's always had a comparatively small number of users, sometimes as few as 300 million. And it has also struggled to ever actually make much in the way of money, because it's not got users on it that really warrant a significant investment in advertising in the way that you get a lot of advertisers on platforms like Facebook. So, therefore, a $250 million fine from the US Federal Trade Commission will be difficult for Twitter to be able to adequately process. It won't be easy for them to sort of lay their hands on that sort of money, or to reach an agreement in terms of how it's going to be paid. So that's a big impact there on Twitter. We have to remember that Twitter remains a major platform, certainly for politicians and people in the media and celebrities to communicate through, because they can put their posts on there. But more and more, it seems that everyday users are turning away from Twitter as a stable, adequate platform in order to communicate on, because of the smaller number of users on there, and the real, businesses aren't really engaging on it because there simply isn't much of a marketplace there in which to broadcast your business and what you're doing. So increasingly, that's a big piece of news for Twitter, and it goes towards their future business model and sustainability in the long run. I don't know if we have any more stories after that. No, we don't. So just to remind you of the ongoing offer with regards to our GDPR compliance manual, you can get that at half price, £99 down from £195. For the electronic edition, if you want the hard copy, that's another £5 so for the postage and packing, so we can put it in the post to you. That's an exclusive offer for our podcast listeners and for our webinar viewers. So simply drop an email to admin at Anson Evaluate, and I'll be happy to process that for you. So that's admin at ansonevaluate.com or admin at digitallawuk.com. Mention that you've heard the promotion on our webinar or on our podcast, and that you would like to have a copy of our manual. This is a compliance manual for law firms, but we've also found that those in other highly regulated professions find it useful as well. And it has things like forms and templates and checklists to give you assistance with regards to getting your organisation up to speed to demonstrate compliance with GDPR on a regular basis. So we hope you've enjoyed our update this week. Apologies for the technical problems, but hopefully they will have been able to edit those out on the version that we end up putting up on our YouTube channel and as a podcast. But thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you. Bye.